Okay, let's continue where we left off. The educational system. Among the Jews of the dispersion, education seems to have taken on an important place at an early date, for they were dependent solely on the perpetuation of their national convictions for their survival. They could keep their national identity only as they maintain themselves as a separate group with their own culture and spiritual life. The Jewish school developed along with the synagogue. The Jewish community usually provided some sort of instruction for children so they might read the Torah, write, and do simple arithmetic. The instruction was limited, but it was thorough. After learning the Jewish creed at home at an early age, the children at school would have memorized passages from the law, certain common proverbs, and some collected psalms. They mastered their studies and could interpret the law from every possible approach. Jewish education was thoroughly integrated, for every branch of Jewish knowledge merged with theology. The law was the core of the curriculum. The Jews favored vocational education. Jewish boys learned to support themselves by working with their hands. Girls were not educated in synagogue schools, but trained at home in household arts. With the fall of the Jewish state, Judaism surrendered to Hellenism and the diaspora, while in Palestine, the Jewish schools expelled Greek learning and laid the foundation for strict Jewish orthodoxy. Enthusiasm for education was an important characteristic of Jewish life. The devout Jews spent much time studying the law. Let's look at the literature. More than any other ancient nation, the Jews were the people of a book. No other nation showed as much interest in their national writing as the Jews showed to the law. The influence of the canonical Jewish scriptures or Old Testament on the New Testament is obvious. Jesus and his disciples were familiar with them from their early years. Jesus and the New Testament authors quoted the Old Testament. Following the era of the Old Testament, which ended with the last prophet Malachi around 450 BC, a body of works developed called the Apocrypha, meaning hidden or secret. The name was applied to works that seemed religious or bore similarity to the biblical books, but which were generally not accepted as authoritative. The apocryphal books include First Esdras, Second Esdras, Tobit, Judith, additions to Esther, the Wisdom of Solomon, Ecclesiasticus, Baruch, the Song of the Three Holy Children, the History of Susanna, Baal and the Dragon, the Prayer of Manasseh, First Maccabees, and Second Maccabees. Most of these books were written in the period of unsettled national life and struggle between the return from the exile and the destruction of Jerusalem. The language and style of all these books resembles that of the canonical Old Testament, but with the exception of First Maccabees, their historical references are not accurate and they have no solid connection with identifiable characters as authors. A second group of works developed that have never been included in the Jewish or Christian scriptures, including the Book of Jubilees, the Testimony of the 12 Patriarchs, the Psalms of Solomon, Third Maccabees, Fourth Maccabees, the Assumption of Moses and Adam and Eve, the Martyrdom of Isaiah, the Book of Enoch, Second Baruch, and the Sibylline Oracles. These writings are known as the pseudepigrapha, and that's a word that technically means false writings, as many are falsely attributed to a known biblical figure. Some of the writings belong to the class of apocalyptic literature, which is predictive and generally uses symbolism that seems grotesque and often inconsistent with itself, prophesies dire physical judgment on the wicked from which the righteous will be delivered, and frequently includes angels. The Old Testament books of Ezekiel and Daniel contain apocalyptic elements. In the New Testament, the book of Revelation is of the same literary type. Apocalyptic literature was usually produced in a period of persecution when people's hopes turned to future deliverance, and such literature was intended to encourage believers to persist in their allegiance to God, while apocalyptic imagery discouraged hostile readers from attempting to fathom its meaning. With the overthrow of Jerusalem in AD 70, Judaism ceased to be an independent political state and became solely a religious community. The priesthood declined and the rabbinate arose. The study of the law took the place of offerings. As the teachers sought to interpret the law, they codified and put into writing the traditions that had grown up around it. The collection of these traditions, with the comments on them by early rabbis, constitutes the Talmud. The Talmud comprises two elements: the Mishnah, the oral law, is known up to the end of the 2nd century AD, and the Gemara, the interpretation of the oral law by the scholars of Babylon and Jerusalem between the 3rd and 5th centuries. These interpretations were of two kinds: the halakha, which dealt with the code of law, and the Haggadah, which was general preaching and included scriptural interpretation not related to the code of law. Together, the halakha and Haggadah are called the Midrash. The Talmud contains 63 sections, each of which deal with some aspect of the law. Two Talmuds, representing the Palestinian and Babylonian schools, are in existence. To this day, the Talmud is the standard of Orthodox Judaism, regulating faith and ritual practice. Let's turn to the sects of Judaism. Judaism was no exception to the human trend toward sectarianism or divisions in religion, though its solidarity was greater than that of the other religions of the Roman world. The largest and most influential sect in New Testament times was that of the Pharisees, separatists who withdrew from all evil associations and sought to give complete obedience to every precept of the oral and written law. Their theology was founded on the entire canon of the Old Testament, which included the law, the prophets, and the writings. They attached great value to the oral law or tradition. They believed in the existence of angels and spirits, the immortality of the soul, and the resurrection of the body. While many of the Pharisees were virtuous and good, others were so intent on obedience to the law that they often became fussy, self-righteous, and hypocritical. And this can be seen in Jesus' conflicts with the Pharisees. Of all the sects of Judaism, only the Pharisees have survived, becoming the foundation of modern Judaism. The Sadducees, according to tradition, derived their name from Zadok, the high priest, during the time of David and Solomon. While less numerous than the Pharisees, they possessed political power and were the governing group in the civil life of Judaism under the Herods. The Sadducees adhered to the strictly literal interpretation of the law, or the Torah, the first 5 books of the Old Testament, and they held only these books to be authoritative, not giving as much importance to the prophets and writings. They also showed no value for the oral tradition of the Pharisees. They denied the existence of angels and spirits and did not believe in personal immortality or resurrection. Politically, they were willing to ally themselves with the dominant Roman power in order to maintain their own prestige and influence. Unlike the Pharisees, they did not survive the destruction of Jerusalem. Due to the end of the priesthood and the Jewish hostility with Rome, their existence as a group ceased. The Essenes were described by the historian Josephus. Little is known of them otherwise. Their name likely was related to the word for holy. They were a definite ascetic brotherhood that could be entered only by those who were willing to submit to the regulations of the group and undergo ceremonies of initiation. They practiced behavior that was restrained, not using oaths or displaying anger. They observed laws such as the Sabbath strictly and were exceptionally attentive to personal cleanliness. Theologically, they bore some similarity to the Pharisees in their close observance of the law and in their supernatural beliefs, which included the idea that the human soul is immortal and imprisoned in a perishable body. Their ascetic tendencies were comparable to the monastic movement that developed in early Christianity. Some of their teachings may have been influenced by Gentile thought, such as their attitudes that resemble the Stoics. The group is not mentioned in the New Testament. Excavations at Qumran, near the Dead Sea, revealed numerous scrolls known as the Dead Sea Scrolls, dated around 66 to 70 AD, the time of the first Jewish revolt against Rome. The ruins at Qumran appeared to reveal a settlement that housed a community which seemed to be flourishing before the destruction of Jerusalem in 70 AD. The discovered manuscripts included Old Testament writings and writings that embodied the religious beliefs and practices of the community. They showed that the Qumran community had withdrawn from official Judaism and undertaken a communal and monastic life in the wilderness. Their theology was practically identical with that of Judaism, holding to one God who placed humans in the world and to whom humans are responsible for their actions. Subordinate to God are the good and evil principles that control life, which influence people to be either sons of light or sons of darkness. Scholars tend to identify the Qumran community with the Essenes referred to in Josephus, given the similarity in geography and chronology, as well as organization and customs. While historians of the time describe the Essenes from outside, the Qumran documents give us primary documents from within the Essene community. Now, it's by no means certain that the Dead Sea Scroll or the Dead Sea Scrolls or the Qumran community they describe are the Essenes. That is the dominant view among scholars, but not the only view. So some scholars hesitate because of the uncertainty to identify the Dead Sea Scrolls or Qumran with the Essenes. They may have been a similar type of ascetic or monastic community, but they at least show enough similarities that they can probably give us some insights into that type of community. And um, again, most scholars think that the communities are the same, that the Qumran was the Essene, the group of Essenes described by Josephus. The Zealots, or the last group, they were not a religious sect, but rather a group of fanatical nationalists who advocated violence as a means of liberation from Rome. They believed that since God is the only Lord, Jews should not pay tribute to the Roman emperor. They modeled themselves after zealous followers of Yahweh in the Old Testament, as well as the Maccabean rebels of the 2nd century BC. During the siege of Jerusalem, they caused dissension that led to the city's downfall. One of Jesus' disciples had belonged to this group. Let's turn to the diaspora. Although Palestine was the traditional homeland of the Jewish race, by far the largest number of Jews in the Roman Empire lived outside the borders of the Holy Land. They were known as the diaspora or the dispersion and were found in almost all the large cities from Babylon to Rome, as well as in many smaller settlements wherever commerce or colonization had taken them. The scattering of the Jewish people began with the two periods of conquest and exile, namely that of the northern kingdom of Israel by Assyria and the southern kingdom of Judah by Babylon. While several thousand Jews returned from exile during the Restoration, a large number chose to remain in the land of their captivity, where they had established themselves and begun to prosper. The conquests of Alexander opened new opportunities for migration and settlement. Many Jews took advantage of the increasing business opportunities and established new homes in the growing Hellenistic settlements. In the Roman Empire, the Jewish settlements increased rapidly, while some Jews under Greek influence lost their distinctive characteristics and faith that separated them from other people. The majority remained Jews and clung to their monotheistic faith and law. Within the diaspora were two distinct groups, the Hebraists and Hellenists. The Hebraists, meaning the Hebrews, were described by Paul, who was one of them. They were those Jews who retained not only the religious faith of Judaism, but also the use of the Hebrew or Aramaic language and Hebrew customs. While some of them lived in Greek cities, probably the bulk of them lived in Palestine, where their worship centered in the temple. The Hellenists were a far larger number of Jews who had absorbed the Greco-Roman culture and had ceased to be Jewish except in matters of faith. They spoke Greek or whatever the common language of the country where they lived. They adopted the customs of their neighbors, and in many cases they were virtually indistinguishable as Jews. Both classes of Jews were mentioned in the book of Acts, where the divisions among them began to endanger the unity of the church. Counting both of these classes, the Jews in the Roman Empire numbered about 4.5 million. They were generally unpopular due to their clan mentality and because they would not join in the public worship of heathen gods. They were even called atheists by those who did not understand how anybody could worship an invisible God. However, their sobriety, industry, and morality made them respectable to their neighbors, who were compelled to acknowledge their ability and integrity. On occasion, the Jews could be turbulent, especially when their religious freedom was threatened. On one occasion, they were expelled from Rome because of an uprising, and they also rioted in Alexandria. There is no evidence, however, that diaspora Jews took any part of the Jewish war from 66 to 70 AD. Let's turn now to chapter 5, Jewish background for the New Testament, 200 BC to 200 AD. We'll start with the nature of Judaism. During this period of 400 years, the rise and development of religious parties and movements, as well as literature, reveal the vitality and variety of Judaism. This culture was marked by a zeal for God and a determination to observe the law or the Torah or law. Judaism was based on the conviction that Moses had received the law from God, and it had been passed down through the generations by godly religious leaders, faithfully preserved through the ages as the foundation for the Jewish faith and life. The key theological emphases of Judaism at the time of the rise of Christianity are reflected in the teachings of Jesus and the early disciples. The only major new principle of the New Testament is that Jesus was the promised Messiah. The complex literature of the period included the Apocrypha, Pseudepigrapha, Dead Sea Scrolls, and writings of Philo and Josephus. Let's look at the Apocrypha and Pseudepigrapha. While they were not considered sacred, some of these books could be regarded as conscious imitations of certain of the Jewish sacred books. These writings encompass two main messages. The first is the sacredness of the law and the need for faithfulness to it. The other concerns apocalyptic ideas designed to give hope in the present and grounds for believing in a future salvation. Apocalyptic themes also occur in the New Testament, which focus on God as creator and judge of humanity, the importance of Israel and God's covenant with Abraham's descendants, the expectation of a coming age with the glories of God's reign, and the ongoing conflict between light and darkness. Now we'll look at the Dead Sea Scrolls. For the study of New Testament backgrounds, the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls is of utmost significance. Several types of Dead Sea Scroll documents have been found: copies of Old Testament books, copies of the Apocrypha and Pseudepigrapha, and documents relating to the life of the community. The Qumran community considered itself to be the true and ideal congregation of Israel, and they believed that by their faithfulness to God's covenant, their land of promise would be cleansed from guilt and liberated from oppression by the forces of evil. Many similarities and contrasts between the Qumran community and early Christians can be noted. Let's look at basic characteristics of the Qumran community. Basic characteristics of the Qumran community include the following. 1. Interpretation of the scriptures was done by a method in which the historical situation found in the prophetic passage was applied to the community's own time and situation. 2. The doctrine of salvation included faith in the teacher of righteousness and fulfillment of the law. 3. Strict separation was practiced. or strict separatism was practiced, and a continuing fight was waged against wickedness and the forces of darkness. 4, a highly disciplined life with a great number of rules and regulations was intended to protect the purity of the community. 5, within the community, there was a strong orientation toward the end time, pointing toward the dawning of God's kingly rule. 6, a related hope was the expectation of the coming of the prophets and a priestly and secular Messiah. So it looks like there's two different messiahs that they believed were going to come. So a little different than mainstream Judaism, which believed in one Messiah. Okay, 7, the community was highly structured and included classes of priests, Levites, laymen, and proselytes. 8, holiness was obligatory, and infractions of the Spirit or regulations were punished by various levels of disciplinary action. Let's look at comparisons with the New Testament. Some points of comparison of the Qumran community with the New Testament include the following. 1, in the New Testament, a similar method of interpreting the Old Testament is common, with frequent pointing to fulfillment. 2, as scripture from the prophet Habakkuk is taken by Paul as a foundation for teaching justification by faith alone. 3, in Jesus' ministry, there was an openness to and reception of people of all kinds, rather than asceticism or separatism. 4, while moral precepts are described in the New Testament, as well as rites such as baptism and the Lord's Supper, one does not sense the detailed and obligatory kinds of obligations occurring in the Qumran literature. 5, the New Testament portrays the kingdom of God as being present in the ministry of Jesus, though it also describes a final conflict. 6, in the New Testament, the expectation of the coming prophet and priestly and secular Messiah is centered on the single figure of Jesus, the Messiah. And he's seen as both a king and a high priest. And 7, the sort of rigid organization described in the Qumran writings is not reflected in the writings of the early church. 8, as in Qumran, the New Testament lays much emphasis on attaining holiness. So that will conclude the lecture for this week. For the attendance assignments, number 2, again, please write 1 to 2 paragraphs or 1 page maximum to answer this question. What is one main idea you took from this week's lecture? And if you would like to earn some extra credit, I've asked you these 3 questions. 1, why had many ancient Greek philosophers abandoned faith in the traditional Greek gods during the New Testament period? 2, why were the Jewish people disliked in the Roman world? And number 3, what apocalyptic themes are shared by the New Testament and Judaism during this period? So again, please write maybe 1 to 2 paragraphs for each question, but try to keep it at to no more than 1 page maximum. And that's if you want the extra credit points. If it's enough for you to get the main attendance points, then you don't need to do the second part. So if you have any questions, feel free to ask me in the email. If you would like a copy of the notes, or if you would like a copy of the suggested paper topics also, you can ask me when you submit your assignment, and or just email me and ask me, and I will send those to you uh, shortly. So I've grading all the assignments you've sent me the past week or so, and um, pleased with the results. I think you're all doing well so far. The class. Again, keep in mind we have our midterm exam and the fifth week, which is 3 weeks from today, Thursday, the 13th. So I think that's the first Thursday in August, if I remember correctly. But you can check the schedule. Hope you all have a great week. We'll see you next time. Take care.